everyone, it's Lisa Ross, though you may know me better as Paper Daisy Creations. And today I have some tips for you on working stranded colorwork in the round. Now, when we're working this portion of this particular sock, we are using two colors across the same row or round. So it's different than like mosaic knitting or slip stitch knitting because you're actually working both colors at the same time. And on the inside, you see these floats or strands that run across the inside of the sock. And because of this, it changes the fabric of your knitting from basic stockinette to being colorwork or stranded knitting. And so I have a few tips that may help you as we get started. So the first thing that I want to tell you is that this portion right here is going to fit a lot more snugly than a stockinette portion. There's a lot more stretch to this part of the sock than there is when you're working stranded colorwork. So in order to accommodate that, my patterns typically include an increased stitch count for the colorwork portion, but I also recommend going up in needle size. So if you use a size 1 for the remainder of the sock, I would recommend going up to a size 2. Depending on how tightly or loosely you knit, you need to find what needle size works best for you in order to get the right gauge. Here is my sock in progress, and you'll notice something right off the bat. It's inside out. And the reason for that is that when you are knitting in the round and you're working these strands across in the round, you're cutting off the corners with your strands and making it extra tight. So what I can do is flip those strands so that those strands are pulled along the outside, giving them a little bit of extra length. And it allows me to work stranded color work that is much better fitting. It doesn't tug on the stitches. They don't pull tightly. Sometimes you can get puckering in stranded colorwork if strands are pulled too tightly across the back. Now, when I'm knitting this, I'm knitting it just the way that I normally would, but I'm looking at, from here, I'm not looking at this part. I'm looking at this part. So it's still just regular knitting, but I'm looking at the inside of the sock at this point when I've turned it inside out. So I've got larger needles. I've flipped it inside out just for this colorwork portion of the sock. And now I'm going to work on knitting my strands. I like to do this with a color in each hand. Now, when you're doing stranded knitting, one of your colors is going to become more dominant than the other. And it really depends on how you do your knitting. It can really vary dramatically. For me, I have found that the yarn that I hold in my left hand is going to be the dominant color. And what that means is that those stitches become a little bit larger than the other stitches. So these light green stitches are a little bit larger than the dark blue ones, and that causes those to stand out more. Thus, you get this really bright and graphic pattern. And if I had made the dark blue the dominant color, those stars would be a bit more reserved. It doesn't really matter too much which one is your dominant color and which one is not. Because if I had knit this all with the dark blue as a dominant color, you would not notice anything different. But if I make the green dominant on one sock and the blue dominant on the other sock, there would be a slight difference between the two. And we like our socks to match, at least most of the time. Another thing to think about is that you want to keep that dominant color the same throughout. For example, if I had made the dark blue dominant down on these little tiny single stitches here, those would not be as dominant, but they would be up here if the green was more dominant. So it's just something to think about and to be consistent. That's the most important thing, is that whichever color you choose to be dominant is that you're consistent throughout your knitting. So I am going to hold my dominant color in my left hand, and I will hold the other color, I suppose recessive color, in my right hand. And now I'm ready to work my stitches. So you can see with this hand, I'm working them continental, and with this finger, I flick it English style. And that is how I do my color work. Now, there are a lot of different ways to do it. This is just how I prefer to do it. Now, I am working a chart similar to this one. It will be slightly different in the pattern. And I'm working this bit right here of 5 dark blue stitches. Anytime I have 5 or more stitches in a row for a sock, I like to catch my float. And what that means is instead of the dark blue just going all the way across on its own, in that center stitch, that 3rd dark blue stitch, I catch the green so that it traps it along the back of my knitting, and it stops that float from being too long. That way, when I'm sliding my foot into the sock, I don't have any issues with my toes catching on any floats. It makes nice small floats and prevents that from happening. So I've worked 2 of the dark blue stitches, and now I need to catch this float. Now, because I'm holding the dark blue in this hand, I can do it this way. I go into the stitch, and then I go under the yarn that I want to trap, which is my green yarn. Then I throw my dark blue yarn as I normally would, and I pull it through the stitch. And all that does is traps that green along the back of my knitting. Let me knit 2 more stitches and I'll show you what that looks like. So here you can see right there, that green yarn is just trapped right along the inside of that. I can also show you what it looks like if I would not trap it, just so you can see the float that I'm talking about. So as you can see, while I work these stitches, I'm looking at this portion right here instead of the part down here. It really doesn't change a lot about your knitting when you are working the knitting inside out. It's just a different way of doing it. All right, so this time I did not catch that float, and you can see it makes this longer float. Another thing that it does is sometimes those long floats can pull tightly, and it can cause puckering within the color work. So I like to try and trap those floats. Now, that is how I would trap my dominant color when I'm doing it, is to go into the stitch, go under the dominant color that I'm holding in my left hand, and throw with my right, and knit it like that. I'm going to get this around to the next round, and I'll show you how I trap the recessive color. Now I'm working the next round. This round includes a 7-stitch run of green stitches, which is my dominant color, the color that I'm holding in my left hand. So I want to trap that dark blue on the 4th stitch, and that is going to help with my tension, and it's going to protect my stitches so there are no long floats that might catch my toes. Now, the way that I trap my yarn for the color that I'm holding in my right hand, so in this case it's the dark blue, is I'm going into the stitch that I'm going to knit, and before I knit it, I pull this yarn over the needle like so. So this dark blue yarn that's in my right hand, I pull it over the needle, then I put the green yarn onto my needle, and I put the dark blue yarn back where it was. Then I pull my stitch through, and it traps my yarn behind my knitting. So it trapped that dark blue behind my green. And let me show you that again. If I'm just doing my flicking of the yarn, I can do it that way too. So I'm going into the stitch, I pull the yarn that I'm not using to the front of the knitting needle. I pull the green yarn up like I'm ready to knit it, but before I do, I pull the yarn, the dark blue yarn back, and I trap my float. And that's just a quick way to trap your non-dominant yarn, or whichever yarn you're holding in your right hand. For me, that is my non-dominant yarn. And let me show you that just one more time. I'll show you it where I would actually throw the yarn. So let me do that again. So if I'm going into this stitch, before I knit it, I take this dark blue yarn and pull it in front of the right yarn, but it's still behind that left needle. Do you see that? But I pull it in front of the right needle. I put the green yarn on like I'm ready to knit it, and then I put the dark blue yarn back behind in order to trap it. And then just working the next stitches. So when I'm knitting that, it can actually go quite quickly as I work my way across. One tip for knitting stranded colorwork is to use a small circular needle. So you can see that I'm using a 9-inch circular needle. I find that to be a much easier way to work stranded colorwork than using DPNs or magic loop or 2 circulars. And I find it to be the case for several reasons. But the biggest reason is yarn management. I can keep this yarn in this hand and this yarn in this hand, and I can work around and around seamlessly without changing which yarn is in which hand, without having to adjust needles. It keeps my tension the same throughout. I don't have any runs of color or any snags or anything that's tightly pulled, and I really appreciate that in my knitting. So using a 9-inch circular is a great way to knit socks on small circumference needles. You may have seen in my other videos, I use 9-inch circulars throughout the sock. The places I do not use it are casting on, binding off, working the heel, or working the toe. Those I like to use other needles for, but for all the rest, I like my 9-inch circulars. Thank you so much for joining me for this little introduction to colorwork knitting. You can find this design and all of my patterns on Ravelry and paperdaisycreations.com. Thank you, and as always, happy knitting.